The corridors of the Royal Alcazar in Madrid smelled of wax and incense, but also of decay. By the first decades of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire was still, at least on paper, the mightiest monarchy in Europe. From Naples to the Netherlands, from Mexico to Manila, it commanded vast territories and unimaginable wealth. Silver galleons still crossed the Atlantic, their hulls groaning with the riches of the New World. Yet behind this facade of splendor, cracks were spreading. The empire was exhausted by endless wars, crippled by debt, and suffocated by a rigid social hierarchy that resisted reform. Spain stood at the height of its geographical reach and on the precipice of decline. Into this fragile world stepped a man who believed he could bend history to his will. His name was Gaspar de Guzmán y Pimentel, Count Duke of Olivares. To the casual observer, he was merely another ambitious nobleman. One more figure in the glittering court of King Philip Roman IV, but appearances deceive. Olivares was no ordinary courtier. He was a statesman of towering ambition, ruthless in method and unrelenting in vision. For over 2 decades, he would dominate Spanish politics, not merely advising the king but effectively ruling in his place. Olivares' rise was as sudden as it was dramatic. Born in 1587 into a noble family with long-standing ties to the crown, he displayed early a talent for strategy, a flair for persuasion, and most importantly, a relentless hunger for influence. When Philip Roman IV ascended the throne in 1621, still a youth of 16, Olivares seized the opportunity. In the young king, he saw not only a monarch, but a blank canvas on which he could paint his designs. His loyalty was rewarded. Olivares was appointed royal favorite, or valido, the most powerful position in the Spanish court. To understand the gravity of this appointment, one must recall what it meant to be a valido in 17th century Spain. Unlike mere ministers, the valido was the king's alter ego, the keeper of secrets, the executor of policies. Philip Roman IV, like many monarchs of the period, preferred the pleasures of art, hunting, and ceremony over the grim tasks of governance. This suited Olivares perfectly. He thrived in the vacuum of authority, constructing a web of patronage and control that placed every lever of power in his hands. The Count Duke's philosophy of rule was clear and uncompromising. Spain must be centralized, disciplined, and militarily vigorous if it hoped to survive. For too long, he argued, the empire had been a loose confederation of kingdoms and provinces, each jealously guarding its privileges. Castile bore the lion's share of taxation and military service, while regions like Aragon, Catalonia, and Portugal enjoyed relative autonomy. Olivares envisioned something radically different, a unified Spanish monarchy where every region contributed equally to the imperial burden. This program he called the Unión de Armas, the Union of Arms. At first glance, it was a rational policy. Why should Castile alone bleed and pay while others stood aside? But in practice, the Union of Arms was a ticking bomb. By demanding that all regions fund and supply troops for the empire's endless wars, Olivares struck at the very heart of local traditions and privileges. His reforms were not merely administrative, they were existential threats to the identities of proud provinces. Still, in those early years, Olivares appeared unstoppable. He projected an aura of authority that few dared challenge. Chroniclers describe his tall, imposing frame, his piercing gaze, and his tireless energy. He rose before dawn, dictated letters, attended councils, and personally oversaw the most minute details of governance. In his presence, even high-ranking nobles quailed. He was not content to be the king's servant. He aspired to be Spain's architect, perhaps even its savior. But power breeds enemies, and Olivares made many. His strict control over appointments alienated the grandees of Spain, who saw their privileges curtailed. His relentless taxation crushed peasants and merchants alike, earning him hatred from below as well as resentment from above. He cultivated an image of moral severity, denouncing corruption and luxury, yet behind closed doors he maneuvered with the cunning of a seasoned intriguer. To his supporters, he was a visionary reformer. To his detractors, he was a tyrant cloaked in virtue. One must imagine the court of Philip Roman IV to understand the atmosphere in which Olivares thrived. The palace was a theater of power, where every gesture carried symbolic weight. The king, solemn and distant, sat as the visible embodiment of authority. But behind the throne, in the shadows of tapestries and candlelight, Olivares pulled the strings. He was everywhere, in councils of war, in financial negotiations, in diplomatic intrigues. Ambassadors from France, England, and the Netherlands quickly learned that access to the king was meaningless unless Olivares approved. He was the gatekeeper of Spain's empire. It was during these years that Spain fought some of its most costly wars. The 30 Years' War raged across Europe, draining men and treasure. The Dutch revolt continued to smolder, requiring constant intervention. Each defeat, each mounting expense, only convinced Olivares that harsher measures were necessary. His response was always the same: more troops, more taxes, more centralization. It was a cycle that fed upon itself, tightening the noose around both Spain and its subjects. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Olivares was not blind. He recognized that Spain's survival demanded reform beyond the battlefield. He sought to modernize agriculture, to stimulate commerce, to reform the treasury. But these efforts were undermined by resistance from entrenched interests and the sheer inertia of an empire too vast and too fragile to change quickly. The more he pushed, the more opposition hardened against him. The irony is palpable. Olivares wanted to save Spain from decline, to restore its grandeur. Instead, his policies deepened the fractures within the kingdom. He sowed the seeds of rebellion in Catalonia and Portugal, two regions that would soon erupt in open defiance. He alienated the nobility, exhausted the peasantry, and eroded the goodwill of the very king he served. Still, in this first phase of his career, Olivares stood at the zenith of his influence. His name was spoken with fear and awe from Madrid to Brussels, from Lisbon to Milan. To many contemporaries, it seemed that he had achieved what few in history could: to rule without being king. But history is merciless to those who grasp too tightly at power. The Count Duke's downfall would come, as all such careers do, not in a single blow, but through a slow erosion of legitimacy, trust, and fortune. For now, however, he reigned in the shadows. The man who commanded an empire yet remained forever a step behind the throne. In the corridors of Madrid, whispers circulated. Was Olivares Spain's savior or its executioner? Was he a genius of statecraft, or a tyrant disguised as reformer? The answers were not yet clear, but one truth was undeniable. As long as Olivares held sway, no decision, no policy, no future was beyond his grasp. The stage was set, the empire was fragile, and the Count Duke of Olivares, intoxicated by power and convinced of his destiny, was ready to gamble everything on his vision of a united Spain. History would soon reveal the terrible cost. The sound of drums echoed through the narrow streets of Barcelona in the summer of 1640. Farmers, artisans, and soldiers clashed amid cries of rebellion, their fury directed not only against local officials, but against the distant authority of Madrid. It was a moment that shook the very foundations of the Spanish monarchy, and at its heart stood one man, Gaspar de Guzmán, the Count Duke of Olivares. To understand why blood was spilled in Catalonia and why Portugal seized the chance to break free, one must trace the logic and the hubris of Olivares' most ambitious scheme, the Unión de Armas, or Union of Arms, a vision of centralization. Olivares was convinced that Spain could no longer survive as a loose collection of semi-independent kingdoms. The empire's enemies were too numerous and too determined, its wars too costly. For nearly a century, Castile had shouldered the empire's burdens alone, paying most of the taxes and supplying the lion's share of troops. This imbalance, Olivares believed, was unsustainable. In 1624, only 3 years after Philip Roman IV's accession, Olivares presented his solution. Each realm under the Spanish crown, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, Portugal, Naples, and others, should contribute proportionally to the defense of the empire. The plan was deceptively simple. 140,000 men would be raised, their numbers divided among the territories according to wealth and population. On paper, the Union of Arms was rational. In practice, it was incendiary. Each region clung fiercely to its ancient privileges or fueros, which exempted them from Castile's heavy obligations. Forcing them to contribute equally was perceived not as reform, but as tyranny. The crushing weight of war, the empire's needs were unrelenting. The 30 Years' War in Central Europe devoured treasure and lives without end. In the Low Countries, the long struggle against the Dutch dragged on. In Italy, rivalries with France demanded constant vigilance. To pay for these wars, Olivares imposed new taxes, requisitioned food and supplies, and conscripted soldiers. Peasants across Castile groaned under the burden. While merchants in Seville and Madrid complained of ruin, even the nobility, once docile under Philip Roman II, grew restless as their incomes dwindled and their privileges eroded. Olivares saw these sacrifices as necessary. Without arms, he argued, there is no empire, yet the people saw only hunger, debt, and despair. A whisper spread the Count-Duke was bleeding Spain dry, Catalonia, pride and resistance. No region felt the tension more keenly than Catalonia. Proud of its distinct language, laws, and traditions, Catalonia had long resisted Castilian domination. When Olivares demanded troops and funds from them, the Catalans refused. They argued that their courts, their representative assembly, had not consented to such demands. The situation exploded in May 1640, when peasant soldiers known as segadors, reapers brought to Barcelona for harvest, turned their sickles against royal officials. The uprising spread like wildfire. Churches and government buildings were stormed. The Viceroy of Catalonia was murdered. The revolt was not just an economic protest, it was a declaration of identity. Catalonia allied itself with France, Spain's mortal enemy. In a desperate bid for survival, for Olivares this was treason of the highest order. He sent troops to crush the rebellion, but instead of restoring order, the campaign deepened the conflict. The war in Catalonia dragged on for years, draining Spanish resources and exposing the fragility of Olivares' vision. Portugal, a kingdom reborn. As Catalonia erupted, another storm gathered in the west, Portugal. United with Spain since 1580 under the crown of Philip Roman II, had never accepted full absorption. Portuguese nobles bristled under Castilian governors, while merchants complained that Spain's wars with England and the Dutch ruined their overseas trade. Olivares, blinded by ambition, tried to enforce the union of arms in Portugal as he had in Catalonia. He conscripted Portuguese soldiers for foreign wars and taxed their already strained economy. The response came on December 1, 1640. In Lisbon, conspirators stormed the royal palace, killed the Secretary of State, and proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King John Roman IV of Portugal. The Portuguese Restoration War had begun. Within weeks, Spain lost control of the kingdom it had ruled for 6 decades. For Olivares, it was a humiliation beyond measure. His dream of a centralized, united Spain collapsed as one of its most important realms broke free, the Count-Duke under siege. By the early 1640s, Olivares was besieged on all sides. In Catalonia, French armies marched alongside rebels against Spanish troops. In Portugal, the Braganza dynasty secured widespread support. In Italy and the Netherlands, Spain faced further defeats. The once mighty Count-Duke, who had sought to impose unity, now presided over disunity and rebellion. His enemies at court grew bold. Nobles whispered that he had brought ruin upon the empire. Even Philip Roman IV, long under Olivares' spell, began to doubt his favorite. Olivares fought desperately to maintain control. He poured men and money into Catalonia, refusing to admit defeat. He ordered the arrest of suspected conspirators in Madrid, tightening his grip on power, but the tide had turned. The vision that once seemed so grand had curdled into nightmare, a lesson in hubris. Looking back, historians see in Olivares' union of arms both the brilliance and the folly of his career. It was brilliant because it recognized a truth: Spain could not survive unless its burdens were shared. It was folly because he attempted to impose reform through sheer will, without negotiation, compromise, or respect for tradition. In Catalonia and Portugal, his policies turned subjects into enemies, allies into traitors. He tried to centralize an empire that was, by nature, diverse and decentralized. In seeking to save Spain, he accelerated its fragmentation, the fires that would not be quenched. By the mid-1640, the flames Olivares had ignited could no longer be extinguished. The Catalan revolt continued. And though Spain eventually regained partial control, the scars remained deep. Portugal would never return to Spanish rule, cementing its independence with the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668, long after Olivares was gone. The union of arms, conceived as a lifeline, became the Count Duke's albatross. It symbolized everything Spaniards had come to fear about his rule: centralization, taxation, and the crushing of local freedoms. A shadow over Spain. Thus, the middle years of Olivares' dominance reveal a paradox. He possessed intelligence, vision, and determination unmatched in his age, yet his inability to bend, to compromise, or to recognize the limits of power doomed his reforms. The man who sought to save Spain from decline instead presided over some of its gravest crises. As the drums of revolt echoed from Barcelona to Lisbon, one question haunted the empire: had Olivares miscalculated, or was Spain itself ungovernable? Perhaps both were true, but for the Count Duke the consequences were personal. His authority, once absolute, was eroding. The shadows in which he had thrived were growing darker, and soon they would swallow him. The year was 1643, and the once mighty Count Duke of Olivares could feel the edifice he had built beginning to crumble beneath him. For more than 2 decades he had been the architect of Spain's imperial policy, the arbiter of its taxes, the voice that whispered into King Philip Roman IV ear. But now the very foundations of his authority trembled. Rebellions had broken out in Catalonia and Portugal. Spain's armies had suffered defeats at Rocroi against the French, the treasury was bankrupt, and the king, once a pliant instrument of his minister's will, began to look upon him with doubt. The decline of Olivares was as dramatic as his rise, a parable of ambition unchecked and a lesson written in the suffering of millions. To understand his downfall, one must return to the ambitions that had animated his career. Olivares had believed with almost religious fervor in the concept of union of arms, a plan to bind together the disparate kingdoms of Spain into a single military and fiscal organism. He sought to level Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, Naples, and Portugal into equal contributors to imperial defense. But this idea, conceived as a remedy, proved to be poison. It shattered the delicate balance of privileges and liberties that had held the polyglot empire together since the days of Ferdinand and Isabella. By demanding uniform sacrifice, Olivares trampled upon centuries of autonomy, and once the provinces felt the weight of his hand, they began to resist, first in whispers, then in open revolt. The Catalan Revolt of 1640 marked the beginning of the end. Known as the Reapers' War, it began when peasants, enraged at being forced to house and feed royal troops, rose up in violence. Their cry of rebellion soon turned into a declaration of independence, and they sought aid from France, Spain's mortal enemy. For Olivares, this was more than a rebellion, it was a personal humiliation. He had always prided himself on his iron control of Spain's territories. Now he found his authority openly mocked. Worse still, the rebellion drained resources at a time when the empire was already overextended. And then came Portugal, for decades. It had been yoked to Spain since the dynastic union of 1580, when Philip Roman II had claimed its throne. Olivares had assumed that Portugal, too, would submit to his union of arms. He was disastrously mistaken. In December 1640, the Portuguese nobility struck, proclaiming the Duke of Braganza as King John Roman IV of Portugal. Stunning speed, the entire nation rallied to the cause. The Spanish armies, stretched thin across Flanders, Italy, and Catalonia, could not suppress the rising. Portugal slipped from Spain's grasp forever. These twin catastrophes, Catalonia and Portugal, would have been enough to doom a lesser minister. But for Olivares, the true coup de grace came from abroad. In 1643, the Spanish army suffered a shattering defeat at the Battle of Rocroi against France. The myth of Spanish invincibility, forged at Pavia and Lepanto, was shattered in the fields of northern France. The tercios, once the terror of Europe, lay broken. The defeat echoed through Europe as the symbol of Spain's decline, and with that defeat, Olivares' reputation collapsed alongside his armies. The court, always a nest of intrigue, turned upon him. Nobles who had long resented his dominance whispered in the king's ear. They reminded Philip Roman IV of the endless taxes. The uprisings, the defeats, the humiliation of lost territories. They painted Olivares not as a savior but as a tyrant, whose reckless ambition had brought Spain to the edge of ruin. Even the people who once endured his policies with sullen obedience began to call for his dismissal. Pamphlets and satirical verses circulated, mocking his pretensions and blaming him for every misfortune. By 1643, Philip Roman IV, though personally attached to his minister, could no longer ignore the clamor. The once devoted king who had relied upon Olivares since his youth now signed the decree that stripped him of office. After 22 years at the pinnacle of power, the Count-Duke was cast aside, forced into exile on his estates. The final years of Olivares' life were a tragic epilogue. He wandered between his properties, brooding over his fall. He composed memoranda and letters, defending his policies, seeking to explain that he had only ever acted for the good of Spain and the glory of the monarchy. But his words rang hollow. The empire continued to reel under the weight of debt, rebellion, and foreign war. The man who had once sought to centralize Spain into a disciplined empire now found himself powerless, a relic of failed ambition. He died in 1645, only 2 years after his dismissal, broken in spirit. Isolated and consumed by bitterness, no monuments were erected in his honor. His name, once synonymous with power, became a byword for arrogance and tyranny. In the judgment of history, Olivares was remembered less as the savior he imagined himself to be and more as the gravedigger of Spain's greatness. And yet, for all his failings, there is a tragic grandeur in his story. He was not a mere opportunist or a petty tyrant. He was a man of vision, determined to reshape an empire that was already in decline. His tragedy was that his remedies were harsher than the disease, his ambitions greater than the resources at hand. He sought to restore Spain's glory, but in doing so, he hastened its fall. The legacy of Gaspar de Guzmán, Count-Duke of Olivares, remains a cautionary tale. Power can be wielded with brilliance, but when coupled with hubris, it leads not to salvation but to ruin. His life reminds us that history often turns not upon the intentions of great men, but upon the consequences of their actions. In the end, Olivares was consumed by the very forces he had tried to control: rebellion, war, and the inexorable decline of an empire too vast to govern. For the historian, Olivares' downfall is more than the fall of one man. It is the symbol of Spain's transformation from the unchallenged hegemon of Europe to a power beset by enemies, weakened by internal divisions, and humbled by the realities of a changing world. His story, written in blood and fire, stands as one of the most vivid examples of how the pursuit of power, unchecked by restraint, leads inexorably to destruction. Thus closed the chapter of Olivares, the grand minister who dreamed of uniting Spain but instead fractured it, who sought to save the empire but instead became the harbinger of its decline. His was the story of a man who rose higher than most, only to fall deeper than he could have imagined.